to our second episode of the Election in Review. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the key races for Senate. We discussed the key races for House in our first episode 2 days ago. If you didn't get to see that, make sure you go give it a watch. Tonight, we have with us Eric Cunningham, who is a regular guest. You guys all know him if you're regular viewers. And we also have Jared Stone, who he comes on Redistricting Radar. He came on the report over the summer, and he's also most well known for his work on the Map Room with Elections Daily, where he's a co-host with Eric. So he's going to be on here tonight as well to discuss the Senate races. So we've got fewer races than we did last time because there are fewer Senate races than House races. So we're going to have more time to talk about each race and hopefully more time to get the panel's opinion on each race, which was a problem last time. So real quick, before we get into this, we'll just start. We're going to be covering all of the competitive races. So that's around 10 Senate races that are considered competitive, or the most competitive, we can say that. And I'll show you the Elections Daily Senate ratings as of now. As you know, our final ratings are coming out later this week. We'll come back to that in a second. So essentially, our current ratings have the Democrats favored to flip the Senate, and we are expected to make a change in Iowa from toss-up to leans Democratic, which should put the Democrats as the favorites to win back the U.S. Senate chamber. So without further ado, I'll throw it off to Jared to start us off. Just talk about what you think about the chamber as a whole this election, some of the key races you're going to be watching next week.
So as Harrison just said, Elections Daily is going to have a few more modifications to the current MAC because we do believe that Democrats are ultimately favored to flip the chamber. This is because of a few reasons having to do with both candidate quality as well as just some of the political and demographic factors. And so there are some seats that are at this point very much out of reach for Republicans. Republicans have consistently been doing poorly in polling. And so there's really an indication that Democrats are going to be able to do well in some states. And some of these states include places like Colorado, which is not really a huge surprise given the fact that it is so strongly Democratic now. And also even states like Arizona. Arizona is a state that has shifted drastically left in recent years. Kyrsten Sinema won it in 2018 as far as a Senate race by over 2%. And we expect the Democrat Mark Kelly to be quite favored here. This is because Kelly has been raising an exorbitant amount of money in fundraising, and he's also done consistently well in polling. And then there are some other states that are a little more nuanced, like Maine, which is traditionally Democratic leaning. But Susan Collins is a senator who has traditionally bucked trends, who has won over a wide swath of crossover support. But we're going to be seeing the fact that these are going to be different times. And then you have some other states. I'm not going to go into them too much in detail because I want to save that for later. But overall, things are looking pretty good for Democrats in a lot of ways. Not only are there states that they're a favor to flip, but there are also some states that are usually Republican leaning, but are now very competitive, and they hold good prospects for Democrats, whether or not they win or lose them.
Thank you, Jared. And Eric, what are your thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you were to talk right now, I think the Democrats would probably be favored to take back the Senate. I do think things could change a little bit in the next few days. It is a very close situation. We're not projecting some sort of massive landslide. There's a lot of really competitive races, and it kind of balances out that way. But if a couple races turn, namely North Carolina and Iowa, which really seem to be the two true toss-up races of the cycle, or we get a surprise in somewhere like Maine or Arizona, it could easily be a little bit more of a livable scenario. Regardless of who wins, the majority seems to be rather narrow for either party at the moment, especially if Republicans manage to hold on. But it's really hard to foresee some of these stretch states getting a clean sweep, which is very rare, especially in a lot of these redder states. So regardless of who has the majority, it's not going to be some overwhelming margin. There's still going to be a little bit more towards a 52, 53 seat majority at most for Democrats, I think.
Thank you, Eric. So we're going to get right into it with our first race. Just like the House ones, I'll give a brief introduction, my thoughts, and then I'll make sure you guys get as much time to talk about each one as we can. And we're going to just basically use the 538 list, and we're going to go in order based off of what they consider to be the most competitive Senate races at this point. So with that, we're going to start with the Iowa Senate race between freshman Republican Joni Ernst and Democratic challenger Theresa Greenfield. This is definitely a race that has evolved into one of the more competitive races in the Senate this cycle. And interestingly enough, now a race that Democrats are favored to win, including in our own ratings when our final ratings come out on November 2nd. It began essentially as a likely Republican race when Greenfield first entered. And yet, as we've seen the national environment become more and more favorable for Democrats, including Greenfield in polling outrunning Joe Biden, even as Joe Biden also does well in Iowa in polls, we've seen Greenfield essentially become the manifestation of the good candidate we've all believed Greenfield to be. And Greenfield has proven herself to be a good candidate. And that's part of the reason why over the last couple of months, we've seen this race transform from one of the more likely Republican holds to a race that Republicans are now favored to lose. If we look at the last poll here, there's actually a new poll out today I want to discuss as well. Previously, our benchmark has been the Siena poll, which was one of the few polls that actually showed Greenfield underperforming Joe Biden. That poll had Biden up 3 in the state, but Ernst up 1. But there was also a poll before that, the Monmouth University poll, that had Greenfield up by 4. And I believe there is a new poll today as well that we're going to talk about that had Greenfield up. I think it was by 5 points. Jackson Bryman sent it to me earlier today, but I have to check again because that's pertinent to our analysis of this race. But overall, we've seen a very competitive race where Teresa Greenfield has proven herself to be a very good candidate. Joe Biden, in a normal situation, would likely help drag a Democrat over the line in Iowa. But Greenfield, as we're also going to discuss, has had a lot of very unique appeal as a candidate. And her campaign has essentially said that she's very appealing to some voters, at least a percentage or two, who are considering to cast their votes and Greenfield. And at the end of the night, Elections Daily, all of us, we're going to be following that race in particular to see how Greenfield does in relation to Joe Biden. So I'm going to start and throw it off to Eric to see what he thinks about this Iowa Senate race.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting contest. Joni Ernst was a very, very good candidate in 2014. This time around, she seems to have kind of been caught off guard in a lot of ways. Obviously, facing a more competitive challenger, a challenger who is not someone who is borderline incompetent like Bruce Braley, literally insulting farmers, going after Chuck Grassley of all people, is saying someone like that is unfit to be on or serve as the Judiciary Committee or serve as along that lines. This time she's faced a much more competitive challenger, someone with a better background that's more in line with needing those crossover voters. If you looked at our bet contest, the pick'em contest we have Trump narrowly favored in our spread, but we also have Greenfield narrowly favored. I think Iowa is a state that really could go either way. You could see a Trump-Ernst win. You could see Ernst kind of being dragged along, like we saw in 2016, where Roy Blunt was kind of dragged across the finish by Trump. Or you could see a scenario where Greenfield manages to pull a little bit ahead, even though there's a Trump win. You could also see a Biden scenario where Biden and Greenfield both win. What I don't think we'd see is a Biden Ernst win. That seems to be a little bit of an unlikely scenario, to be sure. But given the state is seen as one of the more clear toss-ups right now, kind of a reversal from where it was at in 2016, this is definitely an interesting race to look at. I don't think you can count either candidate out at this point. Obviously, it's still Iowa. It's still a state that swung really heavily to the right in 2016, and it's a state where Governor Kim Reynolds, despite trailing in almost most of the public polling, did manage to pull out a win in the gubernatorial race. So you can't really count anyone out here, but the momentum does seem to be on Greenfield's side over these last few weeks.
Mm-hmm. And it's definitely fascinating what you brought up, Eric, looking at the potential possibilities for how this race is going to pan out in relation to the presidential top line. I know we can all express opinions on this show because it's predictions. Personally, I think it is very possible. Again, it is possible Joe Biden wins Iowa. And if that's happening, then Greenfield's likely outrunning him and also winning the Senate race. But from my personal point of view, I think it's very possible. And I do expect that President Trump will carry Iowa by a very, very narrow margin. Even still, I would still expect Greenfield to flip that Senate seat to the Democrats because all she really has to do is outrun the top of the ticket by a percentage or two. And Jared, we'll throw it to you now. What do you think about Greenfield as a candidate? And I'd like to ask you, why do you think Greenfield has had crossover appeal in these polls?
Well, I think it's for a few reasons. Just to reiterate, so in 2016, we saw, and this was the first time it happened in modern history, but every single Senate race, the winner the party that won every single Senate race, the same party won that respective state's presidential races. So that was something that we haven't really seen in any other year before in recent history up until 2016, which is when that happened. And so I do think that there is a strong possibility that Iowa will buck that trend, and Iowa may send their electoral votes to Donald Trump, but also send Theresa Greenfield to the Senate. And so I think the reason why Greenfield is such a strong candidate has to do with a few factors. First of all, I do concur that the Iowa GOP, or the GOP in general, has been caught slightly off guard. I think the fact that Trump won the state by over 9% in 2016, as well as the fact that Kim Reynolds won the governor's race in 2018 after some polls showed her Democratic challenger, Fred Hubbell, pulling ahead. I think those caused the Republican Party to, in a sense, sort of rest on their laurels and to not really see the state as competitive this year, just because it did vote so strongly Republican as compared to the rest of the country. But I also think that Ernst isn't running as much of a charismatic campaign right now as she did in 2014. In 2014, she really did present herself as the outsider. And again, Bruce Braley, as Eric mentioned, was a deeply flawed candidate who had made some controversial comments that would not fly even to a lot of voters who voted for Obama. But I think this year what you've seen is that Ernst has faltered in a variety of ways. And I think that her connection to the farmers of Iowa, who represent a deep constituency there, I think there's been some shadow cast on that. And the fact that she wasn't able to recall some of the prices of some of the goods that were being sold and produced in Iowa, that's something that's very important for someone to run in Iowa, which is granted a very small, relatively small state, one that relies very heavily on agriculture. You need a candidate who is deeply tied and deeply aware of those things. And I think that thus far we've seen that Greenfield has really taken the advantage on that front. And so I think there's that. But I also do think that Iowa is one of these states that, because the Democratic climate nationally is so good for them, Iowa is just becoming a natural toss-up state. Iowa is now voting consistently to the right of the nation, but because the nation is going, so favorably to the Democrats in a variety of races, in a variety of ways, Iowa has naturally shifted sort of back to its usual toss-up status, in both the presidential and Senate races. And so just to reiterate, just to circle back to my point, I think this could be, if there's one state that votes for Donald Trump as well as a Democratic senator, I think that Iowa has a good chance of being that state.
Mm-hmm. And one thing to mention here is that obviously in 2016, there was not a single Senate race that went the opposite of the presidential race. Every single one followed the presidential line, which is really unusual for a federal election. So to see a couple of races happen where, the president and the Senate winner are different parties, that's not historically unprecedented at all.
Mm-hmm. And real quick, just as before we move on to our next race, I guess I'll just get an opinion from both of you. Can you guys just tell me who you expect to win this race? I'll go first. I do expect Theresa Greenfield to narrowly win this race. So I agree with our Elections Daily rating, but I'll reiterate as well that I do expect Trump to narrowly win Iowa at the top of the ticket. And I do think Greenfield's going to outrun Biden by enough to win the seat as well. So I think I would agree with Jared and say that this is a state where we're potentially going to see a difference between the presidential and Senate results, which would be a nice sight to see given how polarization and straight ticket voting has increased significantly over the last 4 years. Eric, what do you think?
Mm-hmm. If you had to put a gun to my head at the moment, I would say Greenfield. I do think there have been a few positive polling signs for Joni Ernst in the last few weeks. You had the Siena College New York Times Upshot poll, which had her running ahead of Biden, who they had Biden winning the state at. I don't think that's a likely scenario, but it was a good poll for her, even though the favorability numbers in the poll weren't necessarily that great. There was also an Emerson College poll, but obviously they have methodology issues right now. So right now, if you had to do that, I would say Greenfield. But again, looking at 2018, there was a polling error there. It's not impossible that you could see something like that here.
And Jared, what do you think?
I would agree. And one final point I would like to drive home just to see as to my reasoning here is the fact that I think that Greenfield is going to run very much ahead of Biden in a lot of that eastern territory along the eastern border of Iowa, along the river there in both the 1st and 2nd districts, some of that sort of industrial territory, if you will. I just don't see Ernst establishing a bulwark in a lot of those crucial suburban counties like Dallas County, right outside of Des Moines, to be able to compensate for that disparity. And so I think in that way, Trump's going to outrun Ernst and cause that disparity.
Because if you look at the 2014 Senate race, the coalition that Joni Ernst won with is very different from a coalition you would expect someone like Donald Trump to win with in a close race. She actually did very well in the suburbs of Des Moines when those were in fact the areas that not only swung the least towards Trump, the congressional district that's contained in these districts was actually his worst district in the state, even compared to Democratic ones like the 2nd, which is the historically more competitive and more Democratic of the ones. So that is a factor here for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, guys. On Iowa, which stands to be potentially our closest Senate race on Election Day, if we look at current polling. Of course, that average has gone up on 538. It's gotten slightly less close, and I expect it will continue to do so once they put in the new poll today that had Greenfield up 6 points, once they throw that into the average. So next we're going to be moving on to the second Senate race on the list, which I know Eric's going to have a lot to say about. And that is North Carolina, between incumbent Republican Senator Thom Tillis, who beat Democrat Kay Hagan in what was considered an upset victory back in 2014. And Tillis is being challenged by a former state senator in Cunningham. And to be frank, Cal Cunningham has been a candidate, as you all know if you've been following the race, who's been fairly controversial. And I'm going to let Eric talk about this, but as you guys know, or probably know about Cal Cunningham, he's seemingly been able to maintain his polling lead even after the scandals surrounding him having a relationship with a woman who is not his wife. So I'll throw this to Eric real quick, and he can talk about first what he thinks about the scandal and how it's impacted the race, and why he believes potentially, at least when we look at the polls, there hasn't been a significant change or dent to Cunningham's momentum.
I wouldn't say so much that there's not been a dent. It's not flipped the race entirely. So the background of this thing, as I first want to mention the more joke scandal, which was Barbecue Gate, which kind of predated the whole texting incident where he was, there was a incident where his social media team posted a picture of him with a propane grill making hot dogs, and he called it barbecue. It was kind of a funny meme for a while, but it actually precipitated this initial thing. It's like, that was kind of in contrast to his really sharp messaging that had been on earlier in his campaign. That was kind of the first gaffe he had. Then you had the stuff coming out from National Files, Patrick Hawley, who is of questionable integrity for quite a lot of reasons. But this stuff that came out was entirely legit, that he did have a physical affair with someone who was not his wife, a campaign staffer, the wife of a disabled combat veteran. Really not a good look. At that point, we had already moved the race to leans Democratic. He had a substantial polling lead of around 6 percentage points. If you look at a lot of these averages, and in a sense, then it's shrunk a little bit. It's not the same sort of lead you would have expected previously. I'm going to go ahead and actually pull this up real quick, because Real Clear Politics has issues with including too many polls. But I feel like the graph does give a look at what's been going on in this race.
Lead for Cunningham at the moment, so slightly shrunk, but still maintains his lead.
Yeah, so what we've seen in the last few weeks has been Cunningham is not having these massive 10-point leads that had been before. Granted, a lot of that was Tillis being at 39, 40%. Now most of these polls show either a tied race or a small 1 to 4 point lead for Cunningham, which is an interesting thing. We saw actually a similar dynamic in the 2014 race where Kay Hagan ran an exemplary campaign for the majority of the cycle. She managed to avoid a lot of the problems other incumbents had with Obamacare. She did manage to weather 2 actually fairly substantial scandals. The first one was the Obamacare rollout. She had been initially had responded fairly poorly in her office to it. She'd responded on a call the Washington Post described as a disaster with reporters. She overcame that, and she overcame her husband having taken his business, having received stimulus money. Overcame both of those without really much of an issue. The scandal that flipped that race was in the last month of the campaign. It had come out that she had attended a fundraiser in New York rather than heading to a committee hearing for her Armed Services Committee. A lot of veterans in North Carolina took issue with that, and that was partially what enabled Thom Tillis to flip the race, despite being behind in every single internal poll his campaign did, except for the final week of the campaign. I mean, that gives you an idea of how rapid the change was in that race and how last minute it was. The gist of that story, I guess, is that Many people had left Tom Tillis for dead in that race because he's frankly not a great campaigner. He's not a great fundraiser. He's not a great public speaker, but he did manage to pull it out. This is the sort of thing that's brought a little bit of life back to his campaign. It certainly put it back into contention as more of a toss-up than before. The question is if like in Iowa, Cunningham outruns Trump or outruns Biden by a little bit, whether or not that's enough for him to carry the seat. It depends on whether you not believe the polls that say it's a tie or whether you do not believe the polls that have him up by 3 points. If you look at the early voting numbers right now in North Carolina, the early voting lead has slipped a little bit for Democrats. It's down to about a 39 to 31 edge in terms of registration. And that could continue to get a little bit lower before Election Day. But we also saw this in 2018 where there was a 3-point edge for Democrats, and that was enough to carry most of the judicial races. We have the race as leans Democratic. We have North Carolina probably going into that column as well. But in our bets, we had this race at 0.5%. It is not unlikely that both North Carolina presidential and Senate races will be within that really thin threshold. And so I guess the gist of this is that Tom Tillis isn't out yet, but he needs to see some more movement over this last week because he's not led a poll for most of this campaign. The last poll he led was from Trafalgar, which is they're Trafalgar. They're not very good. Before that, the last one he led was from East Carolina, and then it had been even months. It had been back in June before he had led a poll. This has been very consistent throughout the entire campaign that Cal Cunningham has had some sort of edge. Whether or not this scandal is enough to close that in the final weeks, like it was in 2014, will be left to be seen.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's very interesting because it is true, as you've noted, that following the scandal, Cunningham's polling leads have shrunk slightly by an average of about 2 to 3 points. As you said, his average lead went down from about 6 points to what's now looking like a 3 to 3.5 point race on 538. In fact, looking at this race, we were just talking about comparing it to Iowa. I would definitely say Greenfield's more likely to outrun Biden than Cunningham is to outrun Biden. Because if you
at
look
this point, if
you look at 538, both of their leads in the state are pretty much even at this point. And while there may be some geographic disparity in terms of who outruns whom, overall 538 actually at this point actually has Biden favored to win North Carolina slightly more than they do Cunningham. They have about a 65% chance of Biden winning, a 64% chance of Cunningham winning. So obviously there's not as much of a disparity between the top line and the Senate race there. But
one thing I do want to mention real quick, and I don't want to step on anyone else's, this is the last thing I'll mention here. What has taken a hit are favorability ratings. Whereas before Cal Cunningham was seen as neutral or positive by voters, he's now seen as negatively as Tom Tillis is, which in a lot of polls is fairly negative. This has taken a massive hit depending on how you look at it. I think one saw as much as a 20-point shift going from +8 to -12 favorables. But again, Tom Tillis is also very deeply underwater as well.
And I want to quickly go to Jared real quick. Jared, do you have anything to say about North Carolina? And do you think there's any chance that Cunningham either increases or decreases his lead in this final week in the election? Or do you think it's pretty much going to stay constant?
Obviously, I don't know if there's going to be another scandal that rattles the election up in the coming days. I mean, we just don't know this. But if not, I do think that this will remain fairly constant. I think that we've seen throughout the campaign that Cunningham has had various different leads over Tillis, to different degrees, but we have consistently seen that the Democrat has had the advantage there. One thing I do want to underscore, just to make sure we get the point across, is that one of Tillis's main issues is that he really does not rally the base up, the Trump sort of MAGA base, as much as some other candidates in other states might. And I think this could be really the nail in the coffin for Tillis if he ends up losing by a very slim margin. It's that a lot of the base that helped him get into office in 2014, they're just not enthused about someone like Tillis. Tillis is not someone who deviates from Trump much as far as policy, but he doesn't convey the same messaging, the same demeanor as Trump, and he's not someone who has really allied himself to Trump as visibly as some other candidates in some other states. And so I think that could be really an issue for him. I'm not, I don't exactly know, what's going to happen in the end. I think I do think that it could potentially go, either way if something helps sink Cunningham a little bit more. But Tillis is really going to have to rely on that rural Republican support that helped Trump get into office. And, places like North Carolina's 11th district, which is served in the western region of North Carolina, it's a district that has gone, friendly to Democrats in some races, but Trump really was able to score up and run up margins there. And so if Tillis is underperforming Trump significantly in those types of rural areas, I think he's going to have a huge problem on his hands.
Mm-hmm. One thing I want to mention here is that at this point, both candidates are running behind their presidential top line in polls. Usually it's Tillis by more than that. The question is, whether or not those voters do consolidate at the ballot box. What I would guess, if you there's a website called Carolina Vote Tracker. I can't remember the exact URL, but if you Google that, you'll find it. You'll be able to kind of see the status of the vote right now. Traditionally, mail-in ballots are where mail-in and absentee are really good for Democrats in North Carolina, and Election Day is really good for Republicans in North Carolina. So if Tillis wants to win, if Tillis and Trump are going to hang on and win North Carolina, they'll need to rely on strong Election Day turnout from base Republicans, which, again, given Tillis's weak spot status with the base, is questionable whether or not he can do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you guys for talking about this race a little bit. It's definitely going to be very interesting on Election Day. One last thing, and I'll throw this question to Eric that came out in North Carolina, and I want to hear his impact on it. Number one, could you tell viewers a little bit about how North Carolina voting's going so far, how many ballots roughly have been cast, and what type of voting is going on? And then second, what do you think as well? There was a new Supreme Court decision today where the court ruled 5-3, and this is in a handful of election-related court decisions. We had one in Wisconsin, we had one in Pennsylvania. Today, the court, in a relatively mixed decision, decided to strike down an attempt for North Carolina to shorten its mail-in ballot reception deadline from 9 days to 3 days. So if you could talk about those things real quick to the viewers, and then after that, we'll go around like we did with Iowa and pick winners.
Yeah, so real quick, I'll show you that website I was talking about where you can kind of see the status of the race right now. So if you look at this right here, this is the vote tracker. This is from the Civitas Institute. They're a conservative think tank, but they do a pretty good job with tracking this sort of stuff. You can see right now, we've got a total of 3.6 million votes cast right now. Of that, 39% are Democratic, 31% are Republican, and 29.5 are unaffiliated. You combine these right over here. This is actually fairly typical of North Carolina at this point, a little bit lower than usual, actually, because of Republican turnout and early voting being good. The question is if on Election Day, Republicans can make up for the strong numbers that Democrats have right now. You'll notice right now, Democrats have a 300,000 vote edge overall over Republicans. For Republicans to win in North Carolina, they need to win most Republicans as well as most independents. Even losing Republican candidates tend to do very well with independents in North Carolina. It's that strong Democratic voter registration edge that gives a pretty stable floor for Democrats. So on Election Day, we'll expect these numbers to be different. You'll notice the trend is going down. The first day of these first days of mail voting were absentee ballots were pretty good. And then you have this initial, great day for one-stop voting, and it's gradually gone down. I actually just voted today, and there weren't a ton of people in line, probably because a lot of people had already voted who were interested in early voting. So that's how that looks. What was the other question you had about? Oh, the lawsuit. Yes. So actually, this kind of stole a story I was writing. I'll have to edit the story about this, but basically, the North Carolina State Board of Elections and the Attorney General created new procedures to cure ballots that were problematic. And initially, North Carolina had a requirement to have 2 witnesses present for an absentee ballot to count. That's been reduced to 1. And then the State Board of Elections decided to reduce that to 0. I'm not sure if this decision affects that, but what the decision will do is it gives a longer window for ballots to be received on Election Day. Again, a lot of these ballots are already in, and early voting does end in a few days. It ends on the 31st, I believe. So I'm not sure how much of an impact that will have, because usually our counting is pretty quick. In North Carolina, most of these mailed out votes, as you saw, have already been in, a month ago, have already been sent. So I'm not sure how much of an impact that will have. What it could have an impact on, that's an entirely different thing entirely. So I'm not sure what impact that has, if it's going to be so much like Pennsylvania, where you have this whole controversy with naked ballots. We don't have that here. We went from absentee to in-person voting, and then election day voting. So I can't, give an exact number, but I do think I don't think this will impact the ability to know who won on election night unless the races are really, really close. And there have been really close ones. I actually counted how many races over the last 2 cycles have been under, around 1 percentage point, and there's 6 of them. There have actually been 5 races that were under a percentage point in the last 2 cycles. So that's a pretty small gap.
Mm-hmm. North Carolina is a fascinating state politically. Lots of close races, especially down ballot as well. So real quick, before we move on to our next race, we're just going to go through and pick winners. Personally, I don't see this race like Iowa. I see it as a race where the presidential top line and the Senate results are going to be fairly close to each other. And I do actually think, especially looking at how Cunningham has begun to decline to the extent where he's basically lined up with Biden in terms of odds of winning, that Biden will end up, if he wins North Carolina, end up carrying Cunningham over the line. So I'm going to say Cunningham wins this race by a very similar margin, whatever ends up being how Biden wins the state. So I would say I'm going to go off and say it's closer than expected and say around 2 points.
Ooh, I'd be surprised if it was 2 points.
Eric.
I think this race is going to be very, very close, as is the presidential one. Again, it depends on that election day turnout. I don't picture this being closer than or further apart than a point either way. And I do think it will ultimately depend on who wins the state. If Trump wins the state, I think that will probably be enough to pull Tillis over. And if Biden wins the state, I don't think that Tillis has really a chance to get over it. So I think it's going to tie pretty closely with the top line either way.
Jared?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very close race. I do think that Cunningham is going to be able to get out a win by a very narrow margin. And I think that, by association, I think Biden, Cunningham is able to win. Biden will probably be able to win very, very narrowly.
Keep in mind, there was a hot mic comment that was caught last week between Joe Biden and Roy Cooper, where they talked about needing to drag Cal Cunningham over the line. I think that kind of gives an idea of where they're looking at. They don't view him as someone who can independently carry themselves at this point, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's North Carolina. We're going to be moving on to the next competitive race, which a lot like Iowa has over the last few months moved into the fold as a very, very competitive race, and one that Democrats are definitely going to try to win, especially if it ends up going to a runoff. And that's the Georgia Senate regular election between incumbent Republican David Perdue, who was elected to replace Saxby Chambliss when he retired in 2014. And Perdue is running against Jon Ossoff, who you guys probably remember from the 2017 special election for Georgia's 6th district, where he narrowly lost to Karen Handel. That seat's back in Democratic hands now with Lucy McBath, but Ossoff's remembered for running that campaign, which was very high profile nationally and was the most expensive House race on record up to that point. So we're going to get into this race. We at the moment have it rated leans Republican, but there's an argument to be made in recent weeks for toss-up. There was actually a debate tonight in the Georgia Senate race here. If you want to go watch it, I'm going to go watch it later. If not tonight, then another one of these days when I have some time. But it's turning into a rather competitive race. And looking at the polls, there's a new poll out today from Monmouth University, which is rated A+ according to 538, that had Ossoff +2. The YouGov poll had Perdue up 1. Siena had the race tied. And Emerson College had Perdue up 2. So if you want to average all of those races together and account for their biases, most of them are high-quality pollsters. And what you get is a pretty much an even race, a very, very competitive race. And a lot of people are starting to expect this, along with the other Georgia Senate race, has the potential to go to a runoff. And traditionally, Georgia Democrats haven't done traditionally well in runoff elections, but there is an argument to be made this time, especially if Cal Cunningham loses in North Carolina and Joni Ernst wins re-election, and the fact that the control of the Senate may come down to runoffs in Georgia. Democrats may be enthused enough to vote in that for the first time in history, defying the trends. So we're going to get into this race, but I really do think it's a fascinating race. Georgia has 2 fascinating Senate elections this year. And yeah, this race has really turned into a nail biter pretty quickly. I would say at the moment it's a toss-up. But let's get your feedback. I'll start with Jared this time. What do you think about this race and Senator Perdue's re-election chances?
This is a fascinating race, I think, for a variety of reasons. Now, if you go back to Senator Perdue's first election back in 2014, it was a decently close race, albeit in favorable Republican conditions, but Perdue won by around 7%. And I think everyone agrees that we're not going to be seeing this type of margin by either candidate this year. But I do think that this is going to be a very competitive race and one that was perhaps not expected to be so. Perdue is someone who has seen some more suburban appeal than other candidates. David Perdue and Johnny Isakson were both candidates that did reach out and get some appeal from some Trump skeptic voters. You saw in 2016 where Johnny Isakson significantly outran Donald Trump in counties like Gwinnett, Cobb, Henry County, the Atlanta suburbs that are traditionally heavily Republican, as well as places like North Fulton County, which is also a traditional bastion of Republicanism. And I struggle to see David Perdue being able to mimic those types of margins. I think that we've been seeing a lot of energy from people on the Democratic side, being able to turn out voters to flip some more traditionally Republican voters in these types of areas. And so I think that we're going to see a lot of energy go towards Democrats. In 2018, Stacey Abrams was able to capitalize upon this and win places like Gwinnett County by over 10%, win Cobb County by 10%, win these counties by substantial margins. And I do think that there's going to be a lot of energy here. One thing I want to say is that the runoff is going to be especially interesting. Usually in Georgia runoffs, you've seen a high degree of participation from white college-educated voters. And so even back in 2018, for the Georgia Secretary of State race between Brad Raffensperger and John Barrow, Raffensperger, the Republican, was even able to win Cobb County in that race, which is remarkable. So I think that unlike in usual years, just because Democrats have been doing better with these types of voters, a runoff may not be as propitious for Republicans as it has been historically. So that's just sort of my rundown of the basic conditions there.
And Eric, what do you think about this race so far?
We're talking about the special or the regular?
The regular election.
Yeah. So the regular one is really interesting. David Perdue managed to defeat a very, very strong Democratic candidate in 2014 and Michelle Nunn. Democrats are really excited about that race, the daughter of former Governor Sam Nunn. She had run a very solid, disciplined campaign, but he managed to win outright without a runoff. I don't think he's a bad candidate at all. I do think this is a pretty bad year, as we've written about before, the potential of Georgia as a more competitive or a blue trending state. So that's definitely something to look at. I still think Perdue has the edge, especially if this goes to a runoff, given Democrats are favored to win the Senate, I think probably on election night. This would definitely be something that would favor Republicans in Georgia, who will be more likely to turn out to prevent, more radical measures from passing in the Senate. But there's not an unlikely chance that either of these candidates could win outright on election night. 2014, people expected this thing to go to a runoff. Most of the polls showed a runoff. But ultimately, Perdue was able to win outright. I don't think that's impossible here. The question is how much these minor party candidates can shave off.
That's something I do want to bring up before we move on to our next race here. Is the third party nominee here, Libertarian Shane Hazel. And the reason why Hazel is playing a role in this race is because Georgia does use a runoff system. And given how close this is, the fact that it's an even race toss-up, Hazel getting around 1.5% to 2% of the vote is enough to pull votes away from Perdue, which is going to help Ossoff. So the Ossoff campaign is definitely thinking, can Hazel pull enough votes away to drive this race to a runoff so Perdue doesn't win outright on election night? In which case, especially if the Georgia runoffs would impact control of the Senate, Democrats could be enthused significantly to turn out again to elect Ossoff. So that's one strategy. Another potential possibility here is the Ossoff campaign's thinking, well, we look at the past, we look at the fact that Georgia Senate runoffs traditionally haven't gone well for Republicans. If the Senate's already decided for Democrats, voters may not feel enthused enough to come out to vote, in which case the Ossoff campaign would want to win outright on election night and would once again hope that it not only drives up support, but simultaneously that Perdue's support is cut even more by a Libertarian. So Shane Hazel's performance here is going to be fascinating. Whether it goes to a runoff is fascinating. So I'm going to leave it here and get your guys' thoughts on this here. So who do you expect to win this race? Do you expect it to go to a runoff or be won on election night? And how do you think this race will relate to the presidential top line? So I'll finish this time. I'll let you guys go first. So I'll throw it to Jared first and then Eric.
So I think this is going to be a very competitive race. I would not be surprised if it went to a toss-up, if neither Republican or Democrat candidate gets a majority. I think Perdue is going to do slightly better than Trump among those traditional suburbanites that I was talking about earlier. But But I see an argument, if Ossoff is able to bring that energy to drive Democratic turnout even more so than Stacey Abrams, I think he's going to be able to overwhelm any sort of rural bulwark for Trump and be able to secure victory at some point.
Mm-hmm. And Eric?
Mm-hmm. I think Perdue has the edge here. I think this is the better of the two races for Republicans at this point. Perdue has a substantial war chest in his own personal fortune and is generally seen as more of a normal Republican than, let's say, either of the two candidates running in the other race. So if there were a race that, Republicans would be favored, out of the two, I think this is more likely, given both are probably trending more towards the toss-up column at this point. But I do think Perdue has the edge here and certainly has the potential to outrun Trump, especially in those suburban counties like Gwinnett, Cobb, even to an extent DeKalb, where Republicans have really cratered lately. There are areas that Perdue could certainly do better in than most other Republicans.
Mm-hmm. Just to give my quick 2 cents on this race real quick, I expect it to go to a runoff. I think Hazel's going to drive it to a runoff because I don't think Ossoff's going to get a majority on election night, and I think Hazel will pull votes enough away from Perdue enough to the point where even if Perdue slightly outruns Trump in the state, it could drive it to a runoff. In the runoff, we're going to have to see the stakes surrounding the runoff and why voters are going to be wanting to turn out in that runoff. But at the moment, I would say I think Perdue is slightly favored in the end to win the runoff. But again, this is an even race in polling. I would by no means count out either candidate here. And Jon Ossoff has definitely proven to be a more effective statewide candidate than I would have thought a couple months ago at the beginning of this race when he entered. So definitely a race to watch on election night to see whether or not it goes to a runoff, because it's possible that it doesn't, even though at this point it's looking more likely than not that it will. It's not like the other Georgia Senate race, which obviously will go to a runoff because you have multiple major candidates. All right, so we're going to be moving on now to and just to clarify for the viewers, our plan here is essentially just going to be to cover the top races, and at the end, we're going to go over the other competitive races, talk about that, how those are going to go, and then we're going to have a sleeper column at the end for sleeper races and any upsets we expect or bold predictions. So we have about 4 more important races I want to cover here, and I promise you, even if we don't get to cover one in detail, we're going to touch on every other race briefly. Maine is another very important race here. Susan Collins was first elected to the Senate back in 1996 over Brennan in her, which up until this point was her most competitive election. Since then has been reelected very easily. She's always been known for that unique brand of Maine moderate republicanism. During the Trump administration, she's increasingly found herself as a rock in between a hard place, whether or not she wants to stick with Trump and the Republican Party, which has become more to the conservative populist perspective, which definitely counters her traditional brand, or whether she's going to form her own independent brand but be shunned from the party and the party caucus. Increasingly, we've seen her take some partisan votes. Obviously, the Kavanaugh vote was considered a partisan vote that really ignited, back at the end of 2019, ignited speculation that she could be in for a very, very close race. Obviously, here we are against Sarah Gideon, who's proven to be a very talented candidate both in fundraising and in overall campaign skills. Obviously, it's a poor environment for Collins, and polarization hasn't helped Collins, but this has definitely turned into a marquee race where Gideon is favored even with even without the ranked choice voting element in this race. If we look at the raw polling average, Collins has had a major polling deficit. Gideon has been leading the polls on average by about an average of 5 percentage points. At the end of the day, though, this race, at least 538 thinks will be slightly closer than that. But Gideon is definitely a strong candidate. And I personally view this race as leans Democratic. Elections Daily rates it the same way. So do our friends at Sabado's Crystal Ball. And behind Arizona and Colorado, I see this as the third best opportunity for a Democratic pickup. So it seems like Collins' days may be numbered, given the way that the country is trending. And it's become increasingly hard to hold that untenable position as a moderate Republican in a state like Maine, especially this year when Biden is expected to do very well in Maine, and it's obviously a hard environment for the Republicans. So real quick, I'll throw it to Eric first off to give his thoughts on this race, then we'll go to Jared.
Yeah, this one's kind of actually been interesting. It's kind of been left for dead for a while now. The ranked choice voting rules have been deemed to hurt the odds of Susan Collins getting another term. The other one of the independent candidates is saying vote for me, but also vote for Sarah Gideon as your second preference, so that the votes don't go, so that Susan Collins can eke out a win in ranked choice voting. And it's definitely been less of a priority for Republicans, given the more pressing need in states like North Carolina, Iowa, or even states like Montana, Kansas, and South Carolina. I do think it's interesting that we're seeing actually some increased spending here in the last week. I don't know if it's just insurance, but the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee is spending $3.5 million in the state in the last week, probably to shore up their support there. But I think that tells me that it's not entirely in the bag yet. It is a leans race, not a likely race. It's certainly possible that Susan Collins could eke out one last win here, but there's just a unique number of circumstances here that make this a really difficult sell, especially given how poorly Trump is polling in Maine. He almost won the state last time. He only lost to Maine by 3 percentage points. He did very well in the 2nd congressional district. Now it seems like he's going to lose the state by double digits and may not even carry the 1st, let alone or the 2nd congressional district. And so lots of problems here.
And real quick before I throw it to Jared, obviously Biden is favored to win the 2nd right now, and Congressman Jared Golden's favored to win re-election in the 2nd by at this point double digits, looking at the polls against Dale Crafts there. But Susan Collins is someone who has managed to maintain leads in the 2nd district. In the polls we've seen with Gidgian up statewide, even by 3 to 5 points, Collins has had enough crossover appeal to win obviously the 2nd district that voted for Trump last time. So something that I'm going to pose to Jared is it still possible in your opinion, and you can completely express your opinion about what you expect to happen in this race here, but if Susan Collins does manage to win, what will be her path to victory, and how much crossovers appeal will she have to garner in terms of outrunning the top of the ticket? Or by how much do you expect her to have to outrun the top of the ticket to win this election?
So she will need to run the top of the ticket by a significant amount, and I think that it's going to run through the 2nd district. And she's a native of the 2nd district. She hails from Caribou, Maine. Her historical ties have been to the 2nd district. She's very well known, and I do believe that she is still going to be able to win the 2nd district, regardless of whether she wins the state as a whole. But I think she'll be able to win the 2nd by a decent margin, perhaps even nearly as much as Trump won it in 2016. But I do not think that she's favored in any sense. I think that Sarah Gidgian is very much likely to win this race. Susan Collins has had some difficulty in the age of Trump trying to triangulate the different wings of the Republican Party. On one hand, she's been consistently ranked as one of the most bipartisan senators. She's had an independent streak, and that's enraged some members of the Trumpian base. On the other hand, by doing things like voting for Brett Kavanaugh, for voting for several Trump judicial appointees, that's also alienated some of that traditional crossover appeal that helped buoy her to victory. And so, the way that I think about it is that she's very much a modern incarnation of her role model and hero, Senator Margaret Chase Smith, who was another moderate Republican senator from Maine. And Margaret Chase Smith ended up losing in 1972. I believe that at this point, Susan Collins is likely to go the same way.
And this race is definitely one of the races that's kind of been put on the back burner, as Eric said, with Republicans essentially recognizing that Susan Collins is definitely looking more likely to lose re-election than to win re-election, and that you've seen Democrats, as Eric said, they have been spending here, obviously trying to shore up and ensure that Gidgian wins. But I think most Republicans are beginning to accept that they have more winnable races in states like North Carolina. They have to defend seats in states like Georgia and Iowa. And to the point where this is starting to look like a race that Democrats are favored to flip, like Arizona and Colorado, although not quite as favorable to flip to them as those races are. It's definitely something that's been changing the look at the race if we're looking at how the party campaign committees have been looking at the race. So real quick before we move on here, I guess we'll go through our picks for this race. I think ranked choice voting is only going to help Gidgian. I think she would win without ranked choice voting at this point. She would get at least a plurality of the vote needed to win with this polling lead. I think Joe Biden is definitely going to help Gidgian, and if Joe Biden has a very strong victory in Maine, it should be enough to stop Susan Collins from winning, even if Susan Collins is, as we expect, given the fact that she still has crossover appeal, going to significantly outrun President Trump and congressional candidates like Dale Crafts in the 2nd district and in the state as a whole. But personally, I would say leans Democratic race. I expect Sarah Gidgian to win here. Joe Biden has a strong victory in Maine, and that only helps Sarah Gidgian. Ranked choice voting helps Sarah Gidgian, and third-party votes that go to Gidgian in the end help Sarah Gidgian. So I would say that this race is one that's looking like, in my opinion, the Democrats' third most likely race to flip to the Democrats in the Senate, behind obviously Colorado, Arizona, and then now Maine. So Eric, your pick here?
I think Sarah Gidgen is indeed favored. The unique ranked choice voting here only really comes into play if obviously Gidgen does not get a majority of the vote, and polling doesn't suggest that's going to be the case. But given one of the two third-party candidates has said openly to put her second vote towards Sarah Gidgen, that would definitely be an advantage to, I think, her, not to Susan Collins. But again, the only reason I would say that this is entirely a lost cause is that weird last-second influx of money from both sides, whether it's a shoring up or whether there's some sort of opportunity that's being seen, of course, with this sort of funding is never known. But that is a sizable amount of money that is being invested into this race in just the last week.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Jared, your thoughts on this race real quick before we go on to Montana.
Gidgen's favored to win. I think Collins has been hovering in the low to mid 40s and polling. I think that that's going to be her ultimate fate. And also one more thing to quickly note is the fact that Jared Golden, the Democrat representative in the 2nd district, is likely to win by a huge margin, and that will surely help Gideon in her prospects.
Mm-hmm. So agreed there. I think we all agree that this is definitely one of the races that's looking more favorable to flip to the Democrats. Obviously, upsets are still in the bag potentially, but it's looking pretty unlikely that Collins secures re-election, which is the end of an era for Susan Collins, who, as you know, had a history of winning by significant majorities in her races.
Winning by a larger margin every time.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. So we're going to be moving on now to the Montana Senate race. Daines had started to gain pretty much an essential lead in the polls here. I personally still believe Daines is the favorite. The polls still show Daines is the favorite. There was a new Montana State University poll today. They're not ranked by 538, but they did have Bullock back in the lead, albeit narrowly. So at the moment, that's an outlier poll looking at the overall trends of polls we've seen here that have shown Daines gaining and maintaining a competitive advantage over Governor Steve Bullock, the Democrat here. If we see more polls that start to show that it's moving back towards Bullock, then we'll reevaluate the race. But at the moment, Elections Daily, we still view the race as leaning Republican on all levels, both the House, the Senate, and the presidency.
It's worth noting the best recent poll was from Siena College, New York Times, which had Daines up by 3 points.
Yeah, so just some brief background. Steve Daines is the incumbent Republican senator here. Daines is being challenged by Steve Bullock, who is Montana's Democratic governor. He was reelected to his second term in 2016, even as Trump won reelection. So he's no stranger to crossover appeal. Obviously, it's harder to have crossover appeal in a Senate race, as those are usually more partisan than it is a gubernatorial election, especially in a presidential year. But it's not out of the question, and he's still going to have enough crossover appeal to outrun Joe Biden, outrun Cooney. The only one who might actually perform evenly with, I think, is actually Kathleen Williams in the House race. Polling has actually shown Kathleen Williams doing better at this point than Steve Bullock overall against Matt Rosendale there. So this is going to be a really close race to watch. But if I talk about my opinion, how the races are going to break down, and I know we're going to move on to you guys for your opinions, I would definitely say that Senate and House are both going to be similar results. Cooney, I think, is going to lose by more than people expect him to. Not a blowout, obviously. I think he's just going to lose by a couple more points than Steve Bullock and Kathleen Williams. But we're going to see how it breaks down. Montana is going to be very competitive. Obviously, Trump is not expected to win Montana by the same margin that he did last time, which was quite significant. But he is still a favorite to win the state. So, Jared, what do you think about this Montana Senate race? Obviously, the momentum overall seems to have shifted back to Daines. But do you see any way that Bullock could potentially pull this out?
So there's absolutely the possibility that Bullock is able to pull this out. But I do think that the energy and what we've seen as far as polling and the numbers is more favorable to Daines. And I think that one of the reasons why is because there's been a long history in Montana of Democratic support down ballot, even despite the state having a Republican lean on the top of the ticket. Democratic governors have run the state since 2005. Also, John Tester is a Democratic senator there who's been in office since his election in 2006. And I think that when you compare the current situation to his reelection back in 2018, which is a relatively close race that he managed to win, the current situation looks a lot more favorable to Republicans than it did back in 2018. And so I think that when you take all these factors into account, and also the fact that there's something to be said about a certain amount of fatigue for having such Democratic presence on all echelons of government in Montana for such a long time, the voters might be wanting a change. And so I think for the governor's race, especially, Republicans are favored. And I do think that in the House and Senate races, both Republicans do have a narrow edge.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And Eric, what do you think briefly about this race? How do you expect it to go on election day?
Yeah, it's interesting. Is Daines he won re-election? He won election in the red wave of 2014. He didn't actually face a competitive race initially. The senator that was being in there was a more credible candidate, but he had to drop out after it had come out that he had plagiarized his some college papers. So his opponent was Amanda Curtis, who's had bizarre ties to the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies.
Still managed to get 40% of the vote, though, which was pretty impressive given the red wave.
Yeah, but it's pretty horrendous for a candidate in Montana, and it's not typically representative of how races in Montana go. So obviously Bullock is a good candidate here. He would have been a better candidate if he hadn't run for president and taken some further left stances on gun control and a few other issues that are unappealing to voters. I do think Daines pulls this out, but obviously he's dealing with a challenging race here that he's not really dealt with before. I mean, before this, Steve Daines hadn't been. I mean, he had been in the House seat for a term, and he had narrowly won that, or he'd won that race, by a pretty good margin. But it's not the same as winning a Senate race. And Montana is weird in that they like to split tickets a lot. And this seems to be one of the more weaker races overall this cycle for Montana Republicans.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And Montana is a very interesting state in that it typically gets the rap of being a safe-ar state at the top of the ticket for president, which is not at all true. And it's definitely a purple state down ballot. Obviously, you have Jon Tester, who was actually reelected by his largest margin yet, the first time he achieved a majority of the vote in 2018 against Matt Rosendale. It was a close state in the 2008 presidential election. Biden's expected to lose it by only high single digits rather than double digits this cycle. And up until 2016, a majority of the row officers as well in Montana were Democrats. Obviously, Bullock and his lieutenant governor, Mike Cooney, they're elected together. That's kind of the last remnant of Democrats in Montana. A lot of those row offices flipped. Still, though, it seems Republicans, all of the row offices here pretty much are competitive. The education superintendent, the attorney general race, even the presidential race is not exactly a race I wouldn't say is competitive. It's at least moderately competitive. And then obviously the House, Senate, and governor races are competitive. So Montana is fascinating in that at the moment in all of those races, Republicans have arguably a small, lean, or persistent advantage in those races, especially in the presidential race. But it's not one that's so clearly decided that the races there aren't going to be competitive. That's what's interesting about Montana. So now we're going to move on. I just briefly want to mention three races that we're not going to talk about tonight, but these races are the ones we expect to be the most likely to flip. So Arizona, Mark Kelly, we expect him to defeat incumbent Republican Senator Martha McSally in Arizona. The race has tightened a little bit in recent weeks, but Mark Kelly still maintains his favorite status and the adage of Mr. Money Printer for his ability to just fundraise astronomical numbers, pun intended. And as well in Colorado, where John Hickenlooper is expected to, he's the former governor, is expected to defeat Senator Cory Gardner. Again, Gardner is the victim of a bad environment in a blue state that Biden's going to do very well in, and it's unlikely to see a significant amount of Biden-Gardner voters. And then obviously the final one happens to be in Alabama, where Doug Jones, who won in a low turnout upset special election against really controversial, I don't even need to say it, candidate Roy Moore. Almost everyone in America has heard of Roy Moore at some point. Doug Jones narrowly won. He's now expected to lose to former Auburn football head coach Tommy Tuberville, who's led most polls by double digits. Obviously, even if Joe Biden were to win Alabama by a small margin, it would still be very tough for Jones to win, even if Jones significantly outruns Biden. That's just how red Alabama is. So those are three.
It's redder than Massachusetts is blue for comparison.
So we expect him to. This is that's pretty much the reason behind the Alabama move. So those are three.
We have it safe.
So those are three seats that we are almost sure will flip versus the other seats we've discussed that are technically within the realm of being the sites of upsets. So I would say finally tonight, we've got a lot more races out there, and I'll go both ways here. So obviously it's easier for the Democrats because it's a Democratic environment. So there are more potential pickups for the Democrats than there are for the Republicans this cycle. But to close this Senate coverage episode, I want each of us to pick our number one sleeper race, or essentially a potential flip. Which one you think, not a race you think will flip, but a race you think out of all of these has the best chance of flipping for both the Republicans and the Democrats, that out of the races we haven't discussed. So the reach races, as I like to call them. So for example, for the Democrats, the reach races are considered South Carolina, Kansas. The Georgia special election is not really a reach race. The Democrat could very well win that. But so for that fact, we're going to exclude that race. We're actually going to have a special episode on that Georgia special election after the election, since it's almost assuredly going to a runoff. So we're going to ignore that for now. So your options for a Democratic sleeper pickup are Kansas, South Carolina, Alaska, Texas, and Mississippi. And the ones for the Republicans, or the best chance of a Republican pickup, are Michigan, Minnesota, and New Hampshire. So out of those races, I want you guys to pick one for the Republicans, one for the Democrats. Talk about recent polling. And you can keep it brief, but just give a little bit of analysis. And again, for our viewers, these are not races we expect to flip. That's why they're sleeper races. We're simply putting them here for the sake of a potential upset for either party. So, Eric, you can go first with your picks.
Yeah, so on the Democratic side, I would think Alaska is still the best bet. Ideologically, the state is much more moderate than either Alaska or Kansas and South Carolina. And even though obviously it's an unusual state, it's easier to cobble together a winning coalition there. In fact, the state's actually had a Democratic senator win in a Democratic or in a presidential year in recently 2008, whereas that's not happened for South Carolina in decades, and it's not happened in Kansas like since the 30s, because there's not been a Democratic senator in Kansas since the 30s. Mm-hmm. So I really don't picture either of those flipping. Alaska is more interesting on that front. The obvious one for Republicans is Michigan. Republicans are hoping for a polling error there. I would put as a distant second is Minnesota. I don't think it will flip, but there have been some really weird polls that have been coming out of Minnesota lately that have the Democratic candidate Tina Smith and Jason Lewis kind of mired in the mid 40s. Obviously, that's not a state that's on anyone's radar at the presidential level or at the Senate level. But it's just kind of weird. In particular, there was just a poll that came out while we were on this podcast from Survey USA that had Tina Smith up by 3, 45 to 42. Will it flip? Probably not. Out of all the states left, though, beyond Michigan, which is the only viable Republican pickup outside of Alabama, kind of by default, this would be Minnesota would be the one.
And Jared, how about you?
So I think it would behoove us all to at least mention Kansas, because Kansas is a fascinating state this cycle. I don't expect it to flip, but I do think that it could be a much closer than expected race. And this is because you have two candidates. You have Dr. Roger Marshall, who represents the Big First District. He's represented since Tim Huelskamp, since he was asked in the primary back in 2016. So by default, he should be theoretically a good candidate. The Big First has elevated a lot of people to the Senate, people like Bob Dole, people like Jerry Moran, and there are more. And so he should have that sort of bulwark already, but we do see an extremely strong Democratic challenger, at least in the perspective of many people, and that is Barbara Bollier. And she is very much emblematic of the moderate Republicans that we've seen historically in Kansas, especially around the Kansas City area, in places like Johnson County, which is a heavily suburban, heavily populous county in eastern Kansas. And Barbara Bollier was a moderate Republican who basically became disillusioned under Governor Sam Brownback and his conservative policies, decided to register as a Democrat, and is now running as a Democrat in the Senate race. And so she has a very interesting background, a fascinating resume. She's also within the medical realm. And she has run a pretty strong campaign. Now, I want to note that a lot of her donations have come from people in like California and New York and other liberal states that have a lot of wealthy donors. And she's gotten a lot of substantial feedback from that. But this could be a very competitive race. And Barbara Bollier is going to be able to capitalize upon recent Democratic gains. You had some moderate Republican state legislators within the area who were primary this year, and so a lot of their seats are favored to flip towards Democrats. That's sure to help her. As well, Laura Kelly, the Democratic governor, won this area handily back in 2018. This is building upon Clinton's gains in the area, especially in the 3rd district, which was a Robert Washington district based in Johnson County, as well as Wyandotte County and parts of Miami County. And so I don't foresee Barbara Bollier losing or winning this county rather by under 20%. She is a good candidate for this. But I think the question is going to be, is she going to be able to pare down Republican margins enough in the state to be able to prevent a Republican victory? And I'm not sure about that. Roger Marshall is a native son of the first. I think he'll be able to win that by a pretty substantial margin, even if it's slightly reduced from Trump. I think that he'll do better in the second district just because Barbara Bollier is not from there. Laura Kelly was, and so that definitely helped her. So I think Roger Marshall is absolutely favored in this race, but this could be a very competitive race within single digits, no doubt. And then I guess for the Democratic seat, Eric went over Michigan and Minnesota. Michigan, I think John James is a very decent challenger. He went against Debbie Stabenow in 2018, and he only lost by around 7 to 8%. And so this was an overperformance on his part. He won much more of the vote than people expected against a pretty entrenched incumbent in Debbie Stabenow. And so I think that's someone with the reserved nature of Gary Peters. Gary Peters is sort of a backbencher senator. He's been pretty quiet, pretty taciturn, I guess you could say, among a lot of senators. And I think that Gary Peters was caught a little bit off guard. I think that that's one of the reasons why this race has become slightly competitive. Regardless, I think the Democrats can be able to pull through. Gary Peters has consistently led by somewhat small, substantial margins within polls. I think that Gary Peters will be able to win this by a few percent. I think it'll be within the single digits. Regardless, I think John James is a very good challenger in theory. He's someone who's be able to capitalize upon a lot of African-American voters, especially ones who have looked more towards the Republican Party. I think he could bring up some more suburban support that's faltered under Trump. I'm not sure if these are the right conditions for him to run in. So I do see the Democrats still winning in that race, but I think it could be a fairly competitive election nevertheless.
Mm-hmm. And my two picks here, I would agree with Jared. I would say, and I don't want to sleep on Al Gross. I'm not saying that. That would be my second pick after this, because I see South Carolina as a race that, despite all the national attention, has somewhat drifted out of the toss-up column back into leans Republican. And I think it has stayed at leans Republican this whole time. Some have even argued back to likely Republican after that Siena poll that had Graham up by 6. But again, I would say at this point, after Alaska, Kansas is the top pick that I have here. And even though it has not elected a Democratic senator since the 30s, and has traditionally been very Republican on the presidential level, I agree with Jared. Barbara Bollier is a very good candidate. There was just a new poll out today. It was a Dem internal that I think had the race within 1 point for Bollier. Bollier was leading, and obviously the last quality non-internal poll from New York Times Siena had Marshall up only 4. So this is undoubtedly a race that's going to be competitive. Bollier is going to outrun Biden, and Biden himself might not do too badly in Kansas, given the way that the urban and suburban areas in Kansas have been trending since 2018. So yes, I think this Kansas race is definitely the one bullish sleeper race you could have for the Democrats. I still expect Marshall to win.
Yes, and one more thing I just want to note on Kansas is that when I brought up the fact that Bollier might win Johnson County by around 20%, that's if she manages to win the state or to come very close. I think it is possible she gets a little bit under that margin within Johnson County, just based on traditional political structures there. But it's not really inconceivable that she could do a performance that's around that margin if conditions are right.
And I would agree with Jared for the same reasons that John James, if there is going to be a Republican who wins. I still think Gary Peters is the favorite. That's what the polling says. There was that outlier Siena poll that had the race close, but John James is definitely the most likely. If there is going to be a Republican pickup, it would come in Michigan at this point. And again, I still expect Gary Peters to win. It's not a good environment for James. He should have run in a better environment, in my opinion, but on paper, he's not a bad candidate. So that's their Senate episode, folks. Thank you for watching tonight. We appreciate all your viewership, and we hope this episode was informative about some of the key races we'll be covering on election night that you should watch. And on Monday, we'll be back for the final episode going over the presidential race. Also, keep the lookout, because on Monday, the day before the election, we'll have our official race ratings and pamphlet released for you to follow along. We'll also have our link be retweeted again for our election coverage, which we hope you will all watch. We've been working hard prepping for this election coverage now for almost 6 months, and we promise you won't be disappointed by it. So thank you again,
be sure
guys.
to stand for that.
and good night.